two more quick odds and ends before we finally get to our first error detection. The first is oblique motion. So oblique motion, as you remember, is when one voice remains constant and the second voice moves against that constant pitch. So in all of the other motions, you have types of motion that we've talked about, you have two voices moving. In oblique motion, you have one voice constant and the other voice moving against that constant pitch. We will allow one instance, just one instance of oblique motion in your first species counterpoint examples. And what that means is you can tie one note across the bar line in an example. Just one, as you see there in the top example. In the bottom example, I just wanted to point out simply that in species counterpoint, all of your species counterpoint examples, you should always label all intervals, and you only need to label the generic interval. So that is, you don't need to include whether it's major or minor, and you also don't need to specify compound intervals. So just remember to label all intervals in every species counterpoint assignment. So finally we come to our first error detection exercise in species counterpoint. You may want to take a minute and review the notes that we've already talked about, and then also take a minute to pause the recording now to see if you can work through this error detection, and then we'll go over the answer together. If this is a bit small on the screen, you can also, we'll be looking at a couple of things closer up in a minute. So I'll now start talking through the solution to the error detection. So please pause and take a minute to work through it. So certain things in an error detection might jump out at you right away. Like for instance, an accidental that doesn't really belong in the key, for instance. But the first thing that you should always do in an error detection is label all your intervals, and when you do that, it'll become clear that right away we have a couple of dissonances that are an issue. So in a minute I'll show you the solution, but right now, label your intervals, and as you do so, even though you don't have to specify, they can be just generic. In certain situations, especially when it comes to the tritone, for instance, it's really worth just noting that so that you don't forget. In addition to looking at the harmonic intervals, remember when you're error detecting that you're still looking at melodies, so all of the same melodic rules apply and see what you can find. And finally, recall that we have very strict rules about how to end, so it's important to make sure that you follow those rules because they're non-negotiable. So here's the solution. Take a second to pause it and take a look. So the dissonances are all in boxes here. So obviously the counterpoint example begins incorrectly and a fourth is not permitted. There is, a tritone outlined there at the beginning, and that C sharp is obviously not in the key. We're in F, not in D. D minor, we're in F major. And the B flat to C sharp creates an augmented second, both going up and coming back down, so that's an issue. In bars 6 and 7, we had parallel octaves, parallel perfect intervals, followed by parallel fifths in 8 and 9, another dissonance, and then finally the exercise ends incorrectly with parallel motion instead of contrary motion, and it does not end on an octave. Finally, melodically, towards the middle of the exercise, you can see we have an unrecovered leap in the upper voice.